Picture 6,000 acres of pine and scrub in the pinelands of southern New Jersey, cleared field by field until, within 9 months, an entire town rose from nothing, populated not by settlers chasing opportunity, but by government contractors racing a war clock they could not stop. This was Amatol, and by the time the last building went up, the site amounted to a small city built for a single explosive purpose: packing artillery shells with Amatol, a volatile marriage of TNT and ammonium nitrate, urgent enough to keep the Western Front supplied with the raw violence that a modern war required. An aspect I found particularly striking in tracing this history is how thoroughly the danger of this work has been embalmed in old photographs and roadside plaques, while the sheer scale of what happened here has slipped from the popular record almost entirely. New Jersey, leaning on its robust chemical industry and its strategic run of Atlantic coastline, quietly became the largest supplier of munitions in the United States during World War I, its factories operating in tandem with its shipyards and rail lines to convert sleepy farmland and forest into round-the-clock production feeding the Allied war effort. This, in turn, transformed the state from a coastal afterthought into an industrial linchpin, one whose plants, staffed overwhelmingly by workers who had never handled explosives before, absorbed a disproportionate share of the risk that industrialized warfare demanded of the home front. As such, the story of New Jersey's wartime manufacturing amounts to far more than a footnote to the Great War. It is a parallel narrative of ambition, chemistry, and consequence, playing out entirely on American soil. By 1918, this ambition had hardened into physical infrastructure of an almost unimaginable scale, and 3 facilities in particular illustrate just how far New Jersey was willing to go. The Atlantic Loading Company, more commonly remembered as the Amatol Arsenal, operated across its full 6,000 acres in Atlantic County, with the surrounding boomtown built to house between 10 and 20,000 workers in homes, apartments, a theater, and a restaurant meant to make the transient population feel settled. The result is a haunting kind of urban planning, a town engineered for maximum wartime output and minimal permanence, one that reached full production only 4 months before the armistice rendered its entire purpose obsolete. Meanwhile, the Bethlehem Loading Company, known locally as Belco, cleared 10,000 acres of marshy pine forest along the Great Egg Harbor River near Estelle Manor to construct a facility unique among ordnance contractors, since it alone handled the entire chain of shell production, from the mining of iron ore through forging, machining, loading, and final assembly. By November of 1918, Belco had turned out over 56,155 mm shells, a production run staffed by workers who lived in the adjacent village of Belcoville, complete with running water, a school, and a YMCA, comforts rarely afforded to a labor force whose daily work amounted to handling live explosives. In short, these were not factories in any conventional sense. They were entire manufactured societies, built at wartime speed and designed to dissolve the moment the fighting stopped. The T.A. Gillespie Company shell loading plant in Sayreville, sited along the Morgan section of town, deserves particular attention since it represents both the most productive and, ultimately, the most catastrophic of New Jersey's wartime facilities. Employing more than 6,000 workers across continuous shifts, the Gillespie plant had a daily capacity of 47,000 loaded shells, a figure that placed it among the largest ordnance operations anywhere in the world at the time. This highlights the almost reckless optimism with which the United States government approached the mobilization of its chemical and manufacturing base, prioritizing throughput over the kind of redundancy and caution that slower, safer construction might have afforded. This left much of the workforce enamored in dangers few of them had ever anticipated, dangers that the plant's relentless production schedule did little to mitigate, particularly for the women who made up roughly half the payroll and who braved conditions the observed record describes as entirely unaccustomed to them. As such, the productivity of a plant like Gillespie cannot be separated from the human vulnerability baked into its very design, a tension that would detonate, combating, before the year was out. New Jersey's contribution, however, extended well beyond shell loading into the deeper chemistry of explosives production itself, and here the state's established industrial giants proved just as essential as its wartime boomtowns. DuPont's plant at Carney's Point, along the Delaware River in Salem County, had been quietly producing smokeless powder and gun cotton since 1892, but the onset of American involvement in the war triggered an expansion of a scale that still strains credulity. By 1917, DuPont had enlarged the facility to 67 times its pre-war capacity, employing 25,000 workers to keep pace with orders that seemed to multiply by the month. This amounts to one of the most dramatic single-site industrial expansions in American history, a sense of urgency running through every acre of new construction as the company raced to satisfy Allied demand. Hercules Powder Company, a DuPont spin-off forced into existence by antitrust litigation, mirrored this frenzy at its Kenville plant, producing 150,000 pounds of cordite daily by 1915 to fulfill British contracts placed well before the United States had formally entered the conflict. As Benedict Crowell, the nation's wartime director of munitions, once explained, a failure of supply meant nothing less than disaster for the men depending on it at the front. Overall, the chemical backbone of New Jersey's war effort reveals a state whose peacetime industries pivoted toward the art of industrial improvisation with a speed that modern supply chains would struggle to replicate even now. None of this productivity came without cost, and the Gillespie plant story reached its grim culmination on October 4, 1918, when a catastrophic explosion tore through the facility in Sayreville, killing approximately 100 workers and effectively destroying the plant just over a month before the war's end. The blast scattered debris across a radius of 1.2 miles, and contemporary accounts describe a chain reaction of secondary detonations that continued for days as fires reached stockpile after stockpile of finished shells. This is now remembered, when it is remembered at all, as one of the largest man-made non-nuclear explosions in history, a distinction that sits uneasily beside the plant's original purpose of protecting American soldiers an ocean away. However, the Gillespie disaster was not New Jersey's first brush with catastrophic loss during the war. The Kingsland explosion of January 1917 destroyed the Canadian Car and Foundry Company's plant in what is now Lyndhurst, an act widely attributed to German sabotage rather than accident. Earlier still, the Black Tom explosion of July 1916 devastated a major munitions depot in Jersey City, an event so violent it registered as an earthquake and stands, even now, among the most destructive acts of sabotage ever carried out on American soil. As such, New Jersey's wartime industry existed under a persistent, doubled threat, vulnerable simultaneously to the ordinary hazards of handling volatile chemicals and to the deliberate malice of foreign agents determined to choke off the Allied supply line at its source. In short, New Jersey's role as America's wartime arsenal reveals a state that manufactured victory at genuine human cost, absorbing both the routine dangers of industrial labor and the extraordinary violence of sabotage and accident in service of a war fought almost entirely offshore. This pattern of rapid construction, breakneck production, and equally rapid post-war abandonment sheds light on a key theme in how the United States has historically treated its homefront infrastructure. Essential in crisis, disposable in peace. It is worth asking, a century later, what modern equivalents of Amatol or Gillespie might be quietly operating in the present, absorbing risk on the public's behalf while attention drifts elsewhere, and whether that same rhythm of urgency, followed by forgetting, is likely to repeat itself the next time a nation calls on its factories to arm a war. As such, the pinelands that swallowed Amatol whole stand as a quiet, overgrown argument that the true cost of industrialized warfare is rarely paid where the fighting happens, but rather in the towns, like Sayreville and Estelle Manor, and the vanished streets of Amatol itself, that manufactured the means to fight it.